Okay, so are you ready to unlock the power of habit?
We are diving deep into Charles Duhigg's book today, and
Yeah.
it's fascinating stuff. It's packed with insights into why we do the things we do.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking brain science, marketing tricks, even football strategy, all of it connected to the science of habits.
What I find remarkable about Duhigg's work is how he takes these seemingly totally unrelated areas like neuroscience, business psychology even, and he kind of weaves them together to reveal these really interesting mechanics of habits. And I think what's really cool about it is it's not just about, individual change. It's about understanding these sort of invisible forces that are shaping our behavior on this much larger scale.
Yeah, and he starts off with this story about Eugene Pauly, this
Yeah.
man who lost his short-term memory but could still go on these daily walks without getting lost.
Yeah, and that's where Duhigg just blows our minds a little bit because he explains that habits, they're not stored in our memory centers in the same way that other information is. They actually kind of bypass those centers altogether.
It's wild, right? And think about it, you've experienced this yourself. Like, have you ever driven home on autopilot?
Right.
Or like made your morning coffee and then suddenly you're like, wait, I didn't even think about that. That's your brain's habit system kicking in. That's like running on automatic.
It's true. It's true. So if habits have this kind of brain power behind them, how do we actually change them? Duhigg breaks this process down into something he calls the habit loop, right?
Yeah, exactly. He describes it as this three-part cycle: the cue, the routine, and the reward. So the cue is basically like the trigger. It's the thing that tells your brain, okay, it's time to go into automatic mode. This could be anything. It could be a time of day, a location, even a specific emotion you're feeling.
So like when my phone buzzes and I feel this like magnetic pull to check it, even if it's probably just spam.
Exactly.
That's a cue.
That's a perfect example. The buzz is your cue.
Yeah.
The routine is checking your phone. And the reward for a lot of us is that little dopamine hit you get from seeing a new notification or, whatever it is.
Even if it's totally insignificant.
Even if it's nothing important. But our brains are wired to crave that little reward.
Yeah. And here's where it gets really interesting for me, I think. Duhigg argues that once you understand your own habit loops, you can actually change them by tweaking any part of that cycle.
Right. And he has this fascinating story about Claude Hopkins, his ad man, who basically convinced America to start brushing their teeth.
I've heard about this.
It's brilliant marketing because before Hopkins, no one really cared about brushing their teeth. It wasn't a thing. But he created this craving. He linked toothpaste to this desired outcome that's like clean feeling in your mouth, even though that need didn't really exist before his campaign.
It's amazing how powerful marketing can be when it taps into those underlying desires, right? But how do we use this knowledge to build good habits? Not just cravings for minty fresh breath.
Right. Well, he uses this other example, Febreze. Remember Febreze? They had this problem initially where the product wasn't selling.
Really?
Yeah, because people didn't have a consistent cue to use it. It wasn't connected to an existing habit.
You don't really smell something not smelly and think, oh, time for Febreze.
Exactly. It just doesn't work that way. So what they did was really clever. They repositioned Febreze as like the rewarding final step in an already established cleaning routine.
Okay.
So people started associating that fresh scent with the completion of a chore. And they started to crave it. They were like, oh yeah, after I clean, I get to use the Febreze.
Like a reward.
Exactly. It's all about the reward.
Yeah.
So the key takeaway here is that it's not just about willpower. It's about strategically using these cues and rewards within our existing routines.
So if I'm trying to build a habit of exercising more, I shouldn't just wait for willpower to strike. I should try to link it to an existing cue.
There you go.
Like having a quick workout after my morning coffee.
Now you're thinking like a habit master.
Right.
That's exactly it. And speaking of mastering routines, Duhigg uses this really interesting example of a football coach, Tony Dungy.
Okay, Coach Dungy, what's the game plan for building better habits? Let's hear it.
Okay, Coach Dungy, what's the game plan for building better habits? Let's hear it. So Coach Dungy's strategy, it wasn't about some magical football tactic or anything. It was pure habit science. He took these incredibly complex playbooks, and he simplified them. He boiled them down to their essence.
So instead of overwhelming his players with a million different plays, he focused on mastering a few really well.
Exactly. He understood that in the heat of the moment,
Yeah.
Under pressure, people naturally fall back on their habits. So by simplifying the routines, but keeping the cues and rewards consistent, he ensured that his players could perform at their best, even in those high-stakes situations.
He basically hardwired those winning plays into their muscle memory. It's fascinating how that works. It seems like the takeaway here, and maybe this connects back to what we were talking about before, is that it's not about like overhauling your entire life at once, right? It's about making these small strategic changes within your existing routines.
Yeah, absolutely. And to illustrate this point even further, Duhigg shares this really compelling story about Paul O'Neill, the CEO of Alcoa.
Alcoa, that's a huge aluminum company, right? Not exactly the first place that screams like habit change. What did this Paul O'Neill guy do?
Right, so when O'Neill took over, everyone expected him to focus on typical CEO things like finances and strategy, all that.
Yeah.
But instead, he zeroed in on one key area, worker safety.
Worker safety. That's an interesting choice. Why focus on that?
Because O'Neill understood something really crucial about habits. You can't just order people to change their entire behavior overnight, right?
Yeah.
But by targeting one key habit, what he called a keystone habit, he could set off this ripple effect that would transform the entire organization from the inside out.
Okay, I've heard that term before, keystone habit. But I'll be honest, I'm a little fuzzy on what it actually means.
Sure, so a keystone habit is basically the habit that has the most significant impact on everything else.
Yeah.
So in Alcoa's case, improving safety procedures meant that workers and managers had to communicate more effectively. This led to increased quality, a greater sense of ownership, and ultimately, higher profits for the company.
Wow. So it's like finding that one domino that when you tip it over, it sets off this incredible chain reaction of positive change. That's amazing. It makes you wonder what your own personal keystone habit could be.
Right.
Like, what's the one thing that if I could just nail that, it would unlock all these other areas of my life?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the good news is even seemingly small changes can have this surprisingly large impact. Duhigg talks about a study where people who simply kept a food journal ended up losing more weight than those who didn't.
Wait, seriously? Just writing down what they ate made a difference. That feels almost too easy.
It's not about willpower. It's about awareness. By tracking their food intake, people naturally started making healthier choices, almost without realizing it. It's like shining a light on those unconscious habits we all have, the little things we do on autopilot every day, that, over time they add up to these big results.
It's so true. We often underestimate the power of those small, consistent actions. But as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Speaking of things that take time and effort, there's another crucial element. Duhigg talks about willpower, which, let's be honest, is a resource we all wish we had more of, especially when it comes to breaking those bad habits.
Absolutely. Willpower is fascinating. It's incredibly important. But also, as Duhigg points out, it's a limited resource.
Okay, so willpower is like that friend who's always down for adventure, but only for a few hours, and then they need a nap.
That's a perfect analogy. Duhigg actually compares willpower to a muscle. It gets depleted with used just like your physical energy.
That makes so much sense. It's like why I can resist that donut in the morning when my willpower's all fresh. But then by the afternoon, I'm like, give me all the donuts. It's completely exhausted. So if willpower is like a muscle, is there a way to strengthen it, to make it last longer?
That's a great question. And the answer is yes. One way to strengthen willpower is through practice. Just like you would train any other muscle. Remember the marshmallow test we talked about?
Oh, right. The experiment where they gave kids a marshmallow and said they could eat it now or wait and get to later. And the kids who waited ended up being more successful in life.
Exactly. Those kids who resisted the immediate gratification of the marshmallow, they were, in essence, exercising their willpower muscles. They were delaying gratification, which is a key indicator of strong willpower. But here's the thing. Duhigg also emphasizes the importance of using our willpower strategically.
Strategically? What do you mean by that?
We only have a limited supply of willpower each day, right? So it's about being mindful of how we use it, about not wasting it on decisions that could be automated.
So instead of constantly having to rely on willpower to resist those tempting donuts, maybe I need to rethink my environment, like not even keeping a jar of them on the counter in the first place. Out of sight, out of mind, out of my stomach.
Exactly. Or let's say you're trying to be more productive in the mornings. Instead of using your precious willpower to decide what to work on first, prepare your workspace the night before.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. Willpower isn't just about brute force. It's about working smarter, not harder. But let's be honest. Some habits are just harder to break than others, even with all the willpower in the world.
You're right.
What do we do about those?
Some habits are so deeply ingrained that, they're incredibly challenging to change. But this is where things get even more interesting. Duhigg argues that some companies like Starbucks, for example, have become masters at, in a way, hacking our willpower. through their training programs.
Wait, Starbucks, the coffee place, what do they have to do with willpower?
So they've developed these incredibly detailed routines for their employees to follow in almost any situation. It's like having a script ready for those moments when willpower alone might falter.
So instead of relying on their own willpower to, say, deal with a difficult customer, a Starbucks barista can just refer to their mental script and follow the steps.
Precisely. It removes the need to rely on willpower in the heat of the moment, when it's most likely to be depleted. And what's fascinating is that this concept can be applied to our own lives as well.
So we can actually train ourselves to respond to those challenging situations with these predetermined routines, rather than just relying solely on willpower, which, as we've established, is a limited resource.
Exactly. Think of it like creating a mental playbook for those tricky situations, just like Coach Duhigg did with his football team.
I love that idea. Instead of panicking when things get tough, we can just flip through our mental playbook and follow the plan. It's like having a secret weapon against those bad habits. But while we're busy crafting our personal willpower scripts, I think it's important to also remember the bigger picture here. Duhigg doesn't shy away from the fact that companies are using this knowledge of habit formation to influence our behavior. And sometimes it feels like they know us better than we know ourselves.
That's a crucial point, and it's where things start to get a bit more ethically complex. Because while understanding the power of habits can be incredibly empowering for individuals, it can also be used to manipulate and exploit.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about this ethical gray area of habit formation. What exactly do you mean? Okay, now I'm really intrigued. Tell me more about this ethical gray area of habit formation. What exactly do you mean?
Well, think about the sheer amount of data that companies like Target collect about our shopping habits. It's not just what you buy, it's when you buy it, how often you buy it, even what time of day you tend to make certain purchases.
Yeah, I'll admit I get those targeted ads sometimes that are creepily accurate. They know I'm craving a specific type of pizza at that exact moment. It's a little unnerving. But is it really that big of a deal?
It can be. You see, they're not just collecting this data for fun. They're analyzing it, looking for patterns in our behavior, our habits, so they can predict and influence our future purchases.
So if I buy a certain brand of coffee every week, they'll send me coupons to keep me hooked.
Exactly. But it goes beyond simple coupons. Duhigg shares this story. It's almost unbelievable. About Target figuring out that a woman was pregnant before her own family knew.
Wait, seriously, how is that even possible? Did they hire a bunch of super sleuths to follow shoppers around?
No, not quite. They analyzed her purchase history. And they noticed these subtle shifts in her buying patterns. Things like unscented lotion vitamins, larger quantities of certain household items, products that pregnant women often start buying early on.
Wow, that's both incredibly impressive and a little bit terrifying. It's like they're building these digital dossiers on our habits, knowing what we'll buy before we even do.
That's precisely the point that Duhigg raises. This kind of data analysis, while incredibly powerful, it presents these really significant ethical questions about privacy and manipulation.
It's one thing to use this knowledge to help people build healthier habits, but using it to predict and influence our behavior for profit, that's a whole other ballgame.
Absolutely. It's a powerful tool. And it requires responsible use. It's a conversation that we really need to be having more of, especially as technology advances.
Absolutely. It's like the old saying, with great power comes great responsibility. But speaking of powerful forces, Duhigg doesn't stop there. He also delves into the neuroscience of addiction, specifically gambling, which feels like a whole other level of habit formation.
It is. And the research that Duhigg presents is fascinating. He talks about this study that compared the brain activity of pathological gamblers to social gamblers. And the results are really revealing.
What did they find?
It turns out that their brains respond differently to near misses.
You mean when you're one number away from winning the lottery?
Exactly. For social gamblers, a near miss is just that. It's a loss. But for pathological gamblers, their brains actually register it as a win, releasing dopamine, the feel-good neurotransmitter, which of course reinforces the addictive behavior.
So even though they're losing, their brains are being tricked into thinking they're winning, making it even harder to break the cycle.
Exactly. It really underscores how deeply ingrained habits can be in our brain's reward system, especially addictive ones, and how crucial it is to understand these neurological processes if we want to break free.
Wow, this entire conversation has been a real eye-opener. We've covered everything from the science of habit loops to the ethics of data collection. So before we wrap up, what are some key takeaways you hope our listeners are walking away with today?
Well, first and foremost, remember that while habits are incredibly powerful, they don't have to control us. by understanding the habit loop. The cue, the routine, and the reward. We can actually take charge and shape our behaviors.
I love that. It's empowering to know that we're not just passengers along for the ride. We have the ability to grab the wheel.
Absolutely. Second, remember that small changes can lead to remarkable results. Don't underestimate the power of those tiny tweaks, like keeping a food journal or linking a new habit to an existing cue. Over time, those seemingly insignificant actions can compound into something truly extraordinary.
It's like that quote, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." And finally, as we navigate this world that's increasingly shaped by technology and data, remember to be mindful of how companies are using this knowledge of habit formation. Just because an app is telling you to buy something doesn't mean you need it. Stay informed, be aware, and make conscious choices.
Couldn't agree more.
This has been a fascinating deep dive. I feel like I need to go back and reread The Power of Habit with fresh eyes now, armed with all these insights.
I highly recommend it. It's a fantastic book.
It really is.
And as you go about your day today, just try noticing those habit loops at play. In yourself and others, even in the way the products are marketed to you, you might be surprised by what you discover.
Great advice. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive. It's been a pleasure as always.
A pleasure was all mine.
And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in. We'll catch you on the next deep dive.